Welcome back to Expert Instruction, the Teach by Design podcast, where we dive deeper into the research surrounding student behavior by talking with the people implementing these practices, where they work, and with the students they support. I'm Megan Cave.
And I'm Nadia Sampson.
Okay, so before we get into this episode, Nad and I kind of have some news. We're taking this show on the road, people. For the very first time, we get to present this whole Teach by Design, Expert Instruction podcast format at a whole conference, so like a grown-up conference where people sit in a room and listen to us. So if any of you are planning to be in Portland at this year's Northwest PBIS conference at the end of April, you got to make a plan to come and see us.
And we're going to try and behave, aren't we?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. For the most part, we've got to be professional. So we got a good spot, the first session after lunch, that's our spot. So it's a good one. And we'd love to be able to look out into the audience and see your faces. I mean, really, Nad, let's be honest. We're really just banking on looking out and seeing anybody out there in the
Any
audience.
faces would be good.
Yes, but your faces, you guys, would be the best faces to see. Dr. Billy Joe Rodriguez, who's been on the podcast before, and Noah Van Horn, who's just the best, will be joining us actually in our presentation to talk about how we can lean on those tier 2 practices to support this growing need that schools have school-wide to support behavior. We're still kind of working out on all the details, but we're meeting up with Billy Joe and Noah this week over coffee, to really solidify the topic. All of us are so excited about the opportunity, and we cannot wait to share it at the conference in April. There's still time to register if you haven't yet. If you've been on the fence, come on. We're a good reason to sign up now. So go ahead and register. We'll put the link to the conference in the description of this episode. Anyway, that's our news. We're so excited about it. Now we got to get back into the details, right, of this episode. We actually have a podcast to tell you guys about. So every February, we devote our Teach by Design space to the research and practices that improve equity in your school. And this month, we're talking about VDPs. We've talked about vulnerable decision points before with Dr. Eric Gervin on this podcast, but it's such a deep topic. There's always so much more to say. So today we're going to keep adding to that conversation. We're talking about vulnerable decision points, or VDPs, and we get to have that conversation with 2 of our colleagues here at Educational and Community Supports. It's so nice, isn't it, to talk with people that you know?
I love that.
We just feel so much more comfortable. It's like a natural, and we got to record it in person, which is so great. All in the same room. Dr. Sean Austin and Maria Reina Santiago Rosario joined us in our conversation today.
Maria is a research associate at ECS. Her research focuses on racial equity in school discipline, measuring teacher expectations of students and culturally responsive practices in the classroom, and supporting students who receive special education services in their transition from middle to high school. Sean is also a research associate at ECS. In his research, he focuses on positive behavior support, implementation science, as well as professional development. Prior to completing this, he worked for several years as a school psychologist, predominantly in middle and high schools, supporting students with behavioral needs. So as soon as Megan and I got together to come up with questions for this conversation, we realized pretty quickly that we would have more to say than would fit in one episode. So
I'm pretty sure our conversation lasted an hour and a half, just coming up with questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So we knew we couldn't do it all in one session, and we decided that we wouldn't try to force it.
Nope.
So in this episode, we explored the nature of VDPs and why it's useful to focus our attention on identifying them in the first place. And we heard from Sean and Maria about the challenges that they faced while helping school teams realize their role in both contributing to the disparate outcomes, as well as implementing strategies to solve the problem.
Those conversations can be so hard to have.
Yes. So Maria and Sean have so much more to say on this topic. So they're coming back for round 2 next month. We hope you'll join us as we talk about what comes next after you've identified your VDPs. You won't want to miss it. But for now, check out part 1 of our series because there's a lot of good nuggets to sit and think about in this one.
Sean and Maria, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Great
It's always
to
nice.
see you.
It's always so nice to record these things with people that we know.
Yes.
So today we're talking about vulnerable decision points, and over in our Teach by Design article, we explored some of that more in depth. So people can, if you haven't listened to it or haven't read it, just pause us for just a second and go over there, check it out. It's got a lot of really good information. But if you want, maybe we can give people just a brief idea of what is a vulnerable decision point. Does somebody want to jump
A
in?
VDP.
I'll take, thank
Yeah,
you,
can we
Matt.
just
So
call them VDPs from now on? Because
Yeah.
boy,
Yeah.
it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. So
Yeah.
yes, we will call them VDPs.
Okay, good.
And so VDPs are essentially these situations in which you're more likely to rely on racial or other bias
Yeah.
to make decisions.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's the crux of it. That's what we're talking about every time we're saying VDP, is just these situations that are characterized by certain circumstances that lead us to make decisions based on information that's not super relevant.
Yeah.
AKA bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would add to that. It's like there's the situation, right? But also your internal state, like your decision, your mind state in that moment,
Yes.
that in combination
Mm-hmm.
can lead to,
Making a
reaction.
decision you wouldn't normally make
Right,
if you were given the time and space to be
Yeah.
fully considered in it,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely.
Yeah. And I remember we spoke with Eric Gervin on the podcast a year or two ago. I can't remember. But when we were talking about it, he used the term implicit bias in that conversation. And so the way that he described it to me was that it doesn't, just because you have it, we all have an implicit bias, but it's a way that we can make really quick decisions based on information that we've collected in the past, right? And so it's a way to help us make efficient decisions when we don't have a lot of time. The problematic part of that is that we get to these places where our decisions can actually be more impacted by a bias, and it affects the outcomes for students or other people in a disproportionate way. So when I think about a VDP, I know what mine are. Do you know what yours are? Like,
Well,
what are those moments when you're
Tired,
Yeah.
stressed,
hungry?
didn't have the caffeine, all the things. Yes.
Yes. Do you guys have your own
Or
VDPs?
lost my keys.
Oh, right. Nad just told us she can't find her keys, so she came in quite a state today.
Yes.
I know I make a lot of decisions in my day. And so by the time I get home, when someone asks me what's for dinner, and if I don't have a plan for dinner, I'm not always kind in my response to them when they say, what's for dinner? If I wasn't so fatigued by my own decision making, I would say, I don't know, what sounds good to you? But in that moment when I've made a lot of decisions in my day, I'm a lot shorter. I don't know. Go do something else. I don't know. Ask your dad.
What are you making? I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. What about you, Sean?
Yeah, I can think of many situations where I go to those default responses of I don't know.
I don't
it's
know.
Not the time. Bedtime for me.
Ah.
Anyone with one or more children understands that bedtime is stressful.
Herding cats. Yeah.
It's a time when you are usually tired and
Yep.
when everyone else is tired. So there's really nothing that works well about that situation. Even
Totally.
if you try to do it early, it's not much change.
No.
So
And it's always the time too when the kids just like spin up, like their energy increases somehow, It's like, what is happening? I've lost total control.
It really makes me think too, how many vulnerable decision points teachers have,
Sure.
that educators have during a day, because they're not dealing with just 1, 2, or 3. They're dealing with students in and out of their classroom, all these different transitions, all these things are happening. And so I don't think we always appreciate
No.
all those VDPs.
No, or notice them as they're happening.
Right.
Because
Right.
they happen all the time.
Right.
So I guess in a way to transition a little bit from our own personal VDPs into what you're talking about, Nad, is that schools are systems. They're little like they're little ecosystems, little communities where we all go and we all have our own experiences, including teachers. And so Sean, in your work, you actually took some data, right? You can explain it for the people, but you took some data to look and see if there were some common moments that happen in schools that lead to more disparities than others. Is that right? So how many schools are we talking about? What's the data set? What'd you find?
So it was 992 schools, so almost 1,000. And it was a national sample. And so it was really, I'm not going to say it was representative of schools around the country, but it was derived from a sample.
Okay.
And the reason that I say that is because it was specifically looking at schools that had significant racial disparities for Black students compared to all other students. And so the patterns that I was identifying in the paper that you read and probably mentioned in the article, those are all schools that have these issues.
You could identify that within their data set there were patterns that said maybe we should look and see what's going on here. So
the purpose was to filter out, okay, of these schools that are having this issue, what are the vulnerable decision points that are present?
Great. So what did you find?
Well, it's pretty consistent with some previous research that's been done by Dr. Gervin, who has been on before, and Keith Smolkowski is another researcher as well, and Kim McIntosh. And so they've identified these patterns of behaviors that are more subjective in nature, or ones that students are more likely to be referred disproportionately for those. So the situations where it's not really clear what is the line of, say, defiance. What is defiant behavior, if you need to define that, and how do you characterize that line between what I can manage in the classroom and what I need to send out?
It's a really big point too, right? Like these classroom, the behaviors that you manage in the classroom compared to the behaviors that you're like, this needs someone else to handle a response. Like I am going to send you somewhere else out of the classroom, right? So there's like a severity of behavior that is left up to the person who's referring or dealing with the behavior initially to determine, right? So those subjective behaviors like you're talking about, where we all define them differently in our minds and in our classrooms.
Exactly. And so what my study did was look at all of the various intersections of behavior, time, and place within schools, and identify the situations that were most likely to result in a BDP, the situation that has the greatest evidence of bias, right? Proportionality. And so the result for the situations, unsurprisingly, defiance in the classroom, and then in the afternoon, in the morning, and midday.
All day. You're talking all day.
So it's not one of those that like, it's like this
happens most in the morning when they show up, or in the afternoon when everyone's tired. It's all day.
Right. Yes. And there were a couple other behaviors further down the list, but the top three were all defiance in the classroom.
Interesting. Interesting. Did you find anything that was surprising in the data?
So
that you were not expecting.
Within this discussion of like the subjective behaviors, we have in our head of what that typically is, right? The behavior that is like, well, it happened or it didn't. That's a more objective behavior. So physical aggression is one of those that traditionally has been considered that way. And in the data, it was pretty clear physical aggression is actually a VDP in many schools. And so we made the top 10 list, which accounted for, I think, 75% of all VDPs in all schools in the sample.
Isn't that interesting? It's kind of, when I was reading about it, that was surprising to me too. But when you think about it, there are different ways of defining what is aggressive behavior, and maybe it's horseplay, or someone's just like bumping each other around or whatever. And when does that then become aggressive behavior? That's the subjective part of it, right? That it's something you can manage on your own in the classroom, is be like, hey, knock it off, or it's no, hey, you're to the office, right. Yeah, that was really interesting to me. I was talking with Kent a little bit, our director here at ECS, and I was talking with him a little bit about it. And he said that there are schools that he's been to where he was observing the behavior in the class or in the hallway, and he noticed students like punching each other in the arm. And he was like, whoa, that's like a lot, you know, like that's kind of intense, but it turns out that culturally in the place where he was, this was just a thing that kids do. And the part of it that was important to them is like how many, it was called taking licks. And it was like, how many punches can you take before it's too much, you know? And it was just like a thing that kids did in that particular area. And the staff didn't have a problem with it, and other kids didn't have a problem with it. And so that behavior, while it looked like aggression or physical aggression potentially, it was totally fine within that context. So it's just interesting how we can all see the same behavior but code it differently, you know, the severity of it, or even what our response to it should be. And physical aggression was one that I hadn't considered to be a subjective behavior, but you know, when you point it out in the data, it's like, well, yeah, of course it is.
Yeah. And so under what circumstances do you consider it,
Right.
right? Like, and if you're just seeing a student in the hallway that you don't have a relationship with, and they do
Right.
something like that, you're not aware of this game, or
Whatever it is.
Yeah, whatever it is, you might respond differently.
Yes.
And that's what the data are kind of indicating.
Yeah. So why are we talking even about BDPs? Like in your work, why does this matter so much? What is the point, and why should we be looking out for these moments? Maria, do you want to share?
Sure. Well, the thing is, like, we have limited cognitive energy, or at least that's a way that I think about this.
Yeah.
So we gotta help people be strategic about when can I use like my efforts to make the biggest interruption,
Yes.
and create more equitable spaces. So we
Yeah.
help schools identify, or individual teachers identify their VDPs, so that they can be intentional about when, you know, do I put a stop to myself, or do I become more aware that I'm in that moment, so I can do something about it.
Right. It's the place where you can put in, it's the smallest change for the biggest impact.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the work that I know you guys do, NAD, in your Swiss trainings, where you help people define their precision, their precise problem statements, right? That you could be looking at just behavior in your school, or you can find the place where you're getting the most behavior.
The who, what, when, where, and why, or the precise.
Yes. And so you narrow it all down to like, where are we getting the most behavior, and why does it seem to be happening, so that you can start there, right? You're not trying to tackle all the things that are happening in your building. You're trying to tackle this one thing so that you have fewer behaviors happening here. And so I think with vulnerable decision points, it's similar. It's a similar idea, right? That you're not just looking at disproportionality and inequity in your school on the whole. You're trying to find the place where you're most likely to make a decision that's influenced by your implicit bias.
Right. So different to when we are looking just at behavior through Swiss, we're identifying that moment not to do something to someone else.
Yes.
But for us to take an action.
Yes.
That is making an impact in disrupting, you know, inequities.
Yeah, it's such an important point, because often when we talk about behavior, we're talking about the behavior that students have, but the referral itself it's both ways, right? It's the behavior we see, and it's our response as adults to that behavior.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking, what I'm hearing you say is that when you're looking at a vulnerable decision point, you're really identifying the response that we have as adults that is most likely affected by our implicit bias or unconscious bias. And so it's knowing when that moment is coming and trying to find a different response, or something that would make it more equitable and intentional, instead of like a knee-jerk, efficient response. Yeah. I guess the next place then that we go is like, once you know what it is, like when that moment happens, there's like, I don't know, how do you describe it? There's like the data that tell you what the vulnerable decision point is. There's the solution to the vulnerable decision point. But at some point, there's this self-awareness that has to happen, right? To know that it actually is our response that's creating this outcome, and that we have somehow contributed to it, and that we're responsible as adults to find the solution and be part of that solution to create a change. So I know that you guys have worked with staff on how to move through this process of like identifying those points and then helping them to understand that what their role is. So how do you help? Where do you start in that conversation so that you don't just say, look at these outcomes, it's not great, and then have everybody go, ooh, I don't know what to do about that, you know?
Well, we start by talking about implicit bias generally and showcase how implicit bias come up in like all these different fields, and like I don't know, like referees and when they're making decisions, in group, a Black referee might be more biased, to call a fault on or a foul on a white player instead, or just like our bias in terms of gender or height and how that's related to the amount of money that you make or things along those lines, so that people understand that everyone experiences implicit bias and it's an automatic response. And across these different fields, people try to become aware of it using data, and identifying these patterns. So that something can be done about it, and just like bringing people along with that, and not starting with like, here's your data, you
Fix it.
You're biased,
You're a hot mess.
People are gonna just listen as are you calling me racist?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And just, identifying that everyone has implicit bias, and everyone experiences moment when we're vulnerable to make decisions that are not aligned with our values. And in terms in the context of schools, and training or talking about VDPs and bringing folks in this journey with you, you're doing this work, in either a sequence or a one-time professional development opportunities outside of real time. So we start with these trainings, talking to them about these concepts and creating opportunities for learning so that they understand what these are, then providing them with opportunities to self-reflect. What the data in my school is telling us, of what these VDPs are. If they're considering also their personal decision states, like what are those triggers for me? And helping them create their own precise problem statement of when these VDPs are. But this is something that needs a lot of practice. It's not like I learn about it, identify the moment with where I could have the biggest impact, and then I'm done with it. We encourage the practice, encourage accountabilities, having teams, create accountability partners, or think of ways where we can remind each other to identify these in real time, because the adults in the school got to learn about this and practice this change in behavior before we even think of modeling this for students, or as a larger community. So we start with the trainings, but then what are next steps that we're going to carry throughout the year to have this at the forefront.
What does that self-reflection process look like? What are some of the questions that you have people consider as they're reflecting on what they see?
So if we're looking at school data and they've identified a group that's identified as being more at risk for exclusion, we have them think of students from that group and behaviors that they may get triggered by.
So let's take Sean's example, right? Defiance in the classroom as a subjective behavior. Let's say that comes up as like, this is the VDP, right?
Yeah.
So then you would have them say, well, what for you would you consider to be defiant behavior? What does it look like
Yeah.
to you? What do you see in your classrooms and how do you respond?
Right.
Would that be, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so we have them think about tell us some examples or write down some examples and share with the group that you're working with
Yeah.
in that moment. And it might be like when students are interrupting me as I am teaching them, or when they are not listening to me, or they
Mhm.
are talking with a peer,
Mhm.
right? But we also have them think about, well, what might be a cultural
Yes.
explanation for these behaviors,
Mhm.
right? And we do spend more time during those trainings to think about like elements of culture and like different behaviors, like clothing wise, or how you talk to adults, and how do you do that? You know, how are you taught to do these things? How do your students go about that now? How is this similar or different, and why? And have them reflect upon, you know, possible cultural explanations, but also a function, like the why to this behavior. Is like, are the student meeting some type of need by, you know, communicating with a peer as you're talking, or you know, something along this line, just looking at the behavior from different places. Because what happens in the VDP is that your mind goes to, you know, like the negative piece to it. Instead of maybe being able to take a moment and see it from another point of view, that because of the circumstance and your decision state, you're just biased to react to a stereotype, or also biased to be in a negative state of mind.
Something that I was thinking about too was that for me, I think a VDP, another one is being interrupted can be like really, it can be a hard thing, you know, when I'm in the middle of talking or whatever, and I'm interrupting, and I realize now that I'm saying that, I think I might have interrupted Nat.
No, we were just about to talk at the same time.
But the other thing that I do is I get excited when someone else is sharing, and then I start to talk at the same time. And so the conversational overlap is something that I do. And yet, if I'm in a professional place, sometimes when someone interrupts me, I'm like, I don't like that, you know? And
Right.
and so it's like having an awareness even of like where my VDP is in conflict with my own personal action.
It makes me
It's
think of
interesting.
some of what you were saying, Maria, too. And for some reason, I keep going back to tardies, like kids that are tardy, right?
Yeah, right.
And I ask, as an educator or as an adult, one of the things I ask myself is, why is this kid late every time? And if I even just have a glimmer of understanding of, oh, this kid has a hard time getting here on time because his and I know tardy, not quite the behavior we're talking about, but still, it's kind of like as an educator, as I'm reflecting on this, what do I not know that I need to know that would help me understand why this is triggering for me, but also, just like you said, what's going on for the student that they're behaving in this way? Why is it a trigger for me? So it's also just this level of understanding that kind of goes internally, but also externally, trying to have a level of understanding about what's going on for this student. And if I had this piece of information, could I have made would that help me make another decision? Or can I remember this piece of information so that next time this comes up, I can say, oh, wait, I remember now. Yeah, something like that. So
Sure.
It's making me think too of a conversation that you and I were having the other day, where this work of defining for us, what does this look like, is an important thing. And then also asking students for their perspective on expected behaviors, or how to define the behaviors that we want to see versus the ones that maybe aren't, like what's appropriate and inappropriate. Because even those terms, right, appropriate and inappropriate, are so different depending on who you talk to. And so getting kids involved or students involved in the process at some point would help to possibly expose, right, those differences that we have. Like, I define disrespect this way, but my students define disrespect this way. And then you see the difference and you're like, oh, You know,
Mhm.
maybe even some of my behaviors they would see as disrespectful. And so that's why they behave the way they do when I'm talking to them, you know, where there's a mismatch there, right?
Yeah,
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 yeah.
that's exactly right.
Having students involved and getting their voice included in the process seems important. And you were saying that the work for adults needs to happen, and then students can become part of this process too.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. We provide these practice opportunities, like
Yeah.
these activities, like
Yeah,
you're talking about an exercise that we call personal matrix.
okay.
Where, we have the values of our school or the
Mhm.
expectations,
Mhm.
and we know what they are, or maybe they know what they are in the school, or at least they've seen maybe a poster or heard them at some point. But then you explore those at home or in their community or with their friends and
Mhm.
see how they're different or not, and try to identify, for the teacher as an exercise of self-reflection. Are there things that I can change in my classroom to make this more of a space that align with my students' values? Is there some room for flexibility, or workplaces where I know there's a lot of code switching happening, or where more practice opportunities are needed, because there's a difference that not that you place like a negative value to it, but you just realize there's just a different in context, and that your kids are navigating, your teens are navigating all the time.
Yeah.
So definitely, but we open the spaces, or like the school, school leadership open the spaces for these trainings to occur, so that the adults, we're learning together as a community. But it starts with us, the adults, and the community, because if we don't do that, we miss a lot of opportunities that happen in real time to teach our students the same things that we're just learning about.
Say more about that.
Like, for instance, talking about BDPs and neutralizing routines, it's very humanizing for students when they see their teachers make a mistake in front of them,
Oh,
and
sure.
then be able
Yeah.
to realize that
Yeah.
happened
In the
and
moment.
go in the moment and call attention to, what I just said or what I just did,
Yeah. Oops.
oops, right? Oops, for whatever reason, without, going
Uh-huh.
into, oops.
Yeah.
And that in itself serve as a learning opportunity for the students, and realize, well, this doesn't only happen to me, it also
Yeah.
happened to adults.
Uh-huh.
And I just saw someone make a mistake, call themselves out, and tell us like what they were feeling, they're providing like the vocabulary or
Yeah.
the alternative behavior, like what you would want them to do instead if they were in that situation. But for the adult to be able to do that, they gotta be aware,
Yeah,
and open to, and some people are more in tune with those things naturally, but not, we shouldn't assume that everyone,
Is there a moment in your training where you see a lot of people go, oh, where like something happens where they go, oh, I get it. I understand what it is that I'm doing, or how this affects me and my responses, or something like that. Because I just know that on a personal level, I've had conversations with people to try and identify the ways in which we contribute to the inequities that happen in our culture, in our American society. And those conversations can go fine. And those conversations can also be tricky, especially with the white people that I know, right? As a white woman talking to other white women, it can be a tricky situation, right? To say, sometimes you actually do something that contributes to the outcomes that other people experience. And it's hard for them to see that because they feel that they are not racist, they're not prejudiced, whatever. And so it's difficult, I think, for them to make the jump from, well, that's not part of who I am, to, oh, I do I do contribute to this in this particular way.
It's like there's a level of defensiveness sometimes where it's like,
Yeah,
not
or just
me.
confusion
Yeah,
in general,
confusion.
you know,
Yeah.
where they're like, I don't
That's
get it.
what I believe.
I don't get it.
or-
I can't
yeah.
be doing this, you know?
You know, one of the first activities that we do as a part of these trainings is like a rapid association test, right? So you're presented with information, words, and you're asked to say, does this belong in category A or category B? And you know, category A might be, you know, this is a male kind of word, and then category B is a female type word. And so we walk them through this test, do a couple practice, and then you present words that you tell them explicitly, okay, male is associated with workplace, the female is going to be associated with home, and then you switch on another round, and you have them discuss and express, you know, was that different for you?
Yeah.
Is that more challenging to do it that second round after being trained to do it the other way?
Yeah.
And so for a lot of people, I think that gets them
So
thinking
like, oh, I
about.
do have these connections built into my brain.
Exactly. And the key to those decisions is it's supposed to be quick. You only get to see each word for about a second.
Yeah.
And so it's just, okay, which category? And you slap your leg one way or the other.
Yeah.
At least virtually, when we're looking at between virtually.
Yeah.
And it becomes like this aha of, oh yeah, that felt awkward. And it's like your brain is working really hard to do it quickly, but when you're doing that, you make mistakes.
Yes. And it's just a mistake.
It's just
Oops. Oops.
So we definitely start with different types of biases before we even talk about race.
Yes. Yeah.
Because when we do, there is a level of defensiveness.
Yeah, of course.
And that's appropriate, and you know, we need to have that be in this space and work through it as a group. And it's definitely not necessarily easy, or you know, the one thing that we do acknowledge is like, well, when we see a video of a circumstance in a park, for instance, that's another example we use, a white male, black male, you know, are they robbing, you know, this bike, for instance? And one thing that's common is people like to think that, well, if I were a passerby, I would stop that person. And it's like, we validate that. Maybe you would. Yeah. Maybe you would. What we know is that pattern. Like most people wouldn't.
Yeah.
For the white person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But most people would call the police on the black person immediately. I try not to question necessarily like the values.
Sure.
You know, it is a moment where people are like, but these are my values.
No, it's confusing.
Yeah.
It's
and
confusing.
it's like we know that sometimes our values are we want to do the best for our kids. Or we think that we are fair and equitable all the time. And maybe you are sometimes, but we know there are situations, places, things, moments where the pattern tells us differently. And bring it back to, this is not just one individual.
No.
This is a collective problem.
Yeah.
Or, you know, and we are part of that collective. Maybe not all the time our decisions influence that, but we know most of the time they're aligned with this outcome that tell us that we're being inequitable. So being able to have those conversations, those moments, validate, you know, that we might think this way. And sometimes that might be the case, because there are people that are doing work on themselves to try to, you know, make better decisions. But the fact is that not everyone is, or even if you are, not every moment you might be able to cut, you know. I think we need to be very human and accept that we make mistakes, and letting a mistake be, you know, okay, like you will have another opportunity. But what I want from you is a commitment to being aware of this and trying and continue that growth. in wherever you are in this process. So there's just
Yeah,
a balance.
yeah. I think that's really nice. It's I think it's a nice place for us to stop and think about that and kind of leave this conversation for people to consider for themselves, like could they commit to becoming more aware of their own vulnerable decision points and the way and the context under which they make decisions that don't align with their values, but that they would want to start trying to make a different choice deliberately, you know, and commit to that work. So I think maybe we can end our conversation here today, but that Maria, maybe you can come back and talk to us a little bit more about how we can be more deliberate in our responses, and we can talk about those neutralizing routines that you know so much about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this part of the conversation anyway. I think it gives all of us some things to think about and reflect on, so that we can dive in next time and think about how we can do things differently. So thanks so much for being here, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.